I think we'll get started because we have a busy program today. It's the order of the day will be that I'll introduce the music. Richard Siegel will speak for as long as he likes. Then there'll be some music. I'll introduce the speaker, Dr. Makowiak, and then he'll give his talk. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Richard Siegel and the NIH Quartet.
Thank you. We're very happy to play for you. This is a group of players from the NIH Philharmonia, MJ Miller, Mark Little, and Jeffrey Peer, and I really thank them for taking time out of their day jobs, which you can see listed up here, to play for you. And our day jobs will hopefully excuse some of our musical inability. So thank you in advance. And so we're going to play for you today the first movement of Mozart String Quartet number 19. And the two things I think that we find interesting and potentially relevant to Dr. Makowiak's talk are the name of the quartet, which you'll find out is named after the very unusual opening of this piece, which is quite otherworldly. And also the date of the piece was composed January 14th, 1785, which was 6 years before Mozart's untimely death. And not only does that make him only 29 years old when he composed this, quite a young man, but also what's not on here is that the string quartet number 18, which was completed immediately before this one, is dated January 10th, 1785, meaning, and Mozart was quite proud of the dates of completion of his pieces, so it's quite possible that he actually wrote the entire string quartet in 4 days. So I think that puts our productivity, when you think about it, that we all get rated on in some interesting perspective. So I hope you enjoy Mozart's string quartet number 19, the first movement, Adagio Allegro.
So that was marvelous. I think you weren't quite honest about your skill set before we started. Thank you very much. And thank you for the time you spent rehearsing and putting it together. I'd like to introduce Dr. Makowiak. He's a professor and vice chairman of the Department of Medicine of the University of Maryland School of Medicine and chief of the Medical Care Clinical Center of the VA Maryland Healthcare System. He's a master of the American College of Physicians, former governor of the Maryland chapter of the ACP, and he graduated from Bucknell University with a BS in biology. He did his MD at the University of Maryland and an MBA at Johns Hopkins, the other good hospital in Baltimore. He began his career in academic medicine as an epidemic intelligence officer with the Centers for Disease Control in the 70s. In 1975, he joined UT Southwestern, and he rose to become a professor of medicine before he went back to the University of Maryland in 1988. This series is really designed for people who've distinguished themselves as academicians, teachers, and clinicians. And throughout his career, Dr. Makowiak has been recognized repeatedly for his work as a teacher and mentor. 12 times since 1993, the graduating class of the University of Maryland School of Medicine has selected him as a faculty marshal, 4 times as the mace bearer. That's 16 out of the last 20 years. In 1992, the graduating class honored him further by inducting him into AOA. He received the Department of Medicine's House Staff Teaching Award 93, Student Council Faculty Award 94 and 98, and the Theodore E. Woodward Award from the Maryland chapter of the ACP for teaching excellence in 2009. In 2007, he was the faculty member asked to address the graduating class at the bicentennial celebration and graduation. And in 2010, the ACP honored him by naming its annual student award the Philip A. Makowiak MD Award, and he's not even dead yet. He has published over 150 papers, editorials, book chapters on a variety of medical topics, and he's best known, I think, in the medical community for his approach and work on fever. And his book, Fever, Basic Mechanisms of Management, now in its 2nd edition, is the first comprehensive monograph since Wunderlich in 1868. For almost 2 decades, Dr. Makowiak has hosted an internationally acclaimed series of historical CPCs in Baltimore, and they've given rise to over a score of peer-reviewed articles, as well as a book entitled Postmortem: Solving History's Greatest Medical Mysteries. He received the ACP 2010 Nicholas E. Davies Memorial Scholar Award for this in the Humanities and History of Medicine, and he's become established as one of today's most accomplished medical historians. Oxford University Press is publishing a sequel to Postmortem entitled Diagnosing Giants, Solving the Medical Mysteries of 13 Patients Who Changed the World. That's this year. On a more personal note, I did my gastroenterology and hepatology training at Maryland, and I can honestly say that Dr. Makowiak is a superb teacher, clinician, speaks to patients, sees patients, speaks to them, spends time with them, and he cares deeply about not only the patient, but the well-being of the house staff, the hospital, and the faculty. And I was thoroughly impressed during my time at the sincerity and the depth of character that Dr. Makowiak displayed. It's an honor to have you here today.
No, the honor's all mine being here today. Theo, thank you very much for inviting me. Ed Tremont, where are you? Thank you. Ed, thank you for suggesting me, and Bob Munford. Took several years. I guess this must be a slow year, but I'm grateful to be here anyway. So you usually start these presentations by declaring your potential conflicts of interest. I have only one, and that is I shamelessly promote these 2 books. And there they are. So we can move on to the next slide. So I am going to be speaking about Mozart. And you might ask yourself, how could a doctor working at the Baltimore VA hospital have the audacity to say anything about a man such as Mozart? Well, the answer, I mean, there are a number of answers you could give. One is that disease is the great equalizer. And Mozart's illnesses and his death made him no greater or lesser a person than any of us. We'll all travel the same route he did. And more importantly, potentially there's some lessons to learn from him. He lived from 1756 to December of 1791, as you've heard, and I'll trace the course of his medical history throughout that time. But as I begin this talk, one might ask oneself, why would we care about a funny-looking little man with a pockmarked face, an inflated ego, who died over 200 years ago? Why would we be interested in the medical history and the illness that took him just short of his 36th birthday? Well, obviously, the answer is because he was an extraordinary talent. I mean, this is almost unbelievable, but it's got to be true because it's documented repeatedly in letters and biographies and all sorts of things. At age 3, he was already playing the harpsichord. At age 4, he was composing minuets. Can you imagine that? I mean, I have a granddaughter who is 18 months of age, and she's barely saying any words, you know. I mean, in any case, this was true. By age 7, when he was already a musical sensation, he was composing violin sonatas. And by the time he died, during this brief life, he had composed 626 works in all, 22 operas, 27 string quartets, 40 violin sonatas, 50 symphonies, 28 piano concertos, and 17 masses. So this is why we think so much about him, why we spend so much time talking about him, his life, and listening to his music. In fact, for many, the beauty of his music transcends that of any composer. Even the great Beethoven, who had no regard to speak of for any other composer's work than his own, held Mozart in awe. In fact, Beethoven in his writing does not mention Mozart as his favorite other composer. Anybody know who that would have been? Pardon me? It was Handel, exactly. So he said that. However, after Beethoven's death, when his belongings were examined, other than his own compositions, the composer who was most represented in his personal effects were the works of Mozart. So when Mozart died on December 5th, 1791, Franz Joseph Haydn predicted that posterity would not see such talent again in 100 years. I'd say a gross underestimate at best. Many would suggest that we could never, it's possible we will never see such talent again. Now, when he died, there was, and his illness was strange, and I'll go over that with you. There was tremendous speculation, and this has gone on for 200 years, as to what could possibly have taken him off. And if you count them all, it's over 100 potential diagnoses that have been offered that range from poison, as in Amadeus, the movie, to trichinosis. And I'll get back to both of them. So what was the nature of the strange illness that carried Mozart off just short of his 36th birthday, and what might possibly have been its cause? So here's Mozart. It's tough to know how old he was then. He was probably about 7, already a sensation. His father is standing behind him, took advantage of his talent, made a living off of it and tried to keep him as small for as long as possible so that he could be presented as a child long after he started to approach puberty. So his medical history. So he was unhealthy virtually throughout the duration of his life, and his poor health probably began in infancy with malnutrition, because at that time the philosophy was that the proper nutrition for a newborn was barley water. He survived. His sister survived, but 5 siblings did not. And that may have been in part due to the malnutrition. But in fact, in Europe at that time, infant mortality was about 60%. So the infant mortality in that family was a bit higher, but not that much. And so let me just see, do I have a, here we go, sorry. And then throughout his childhood, he had recurrent streptococcal-related disorders, and they're listed here for you. Age 6, erythema nodosum. Age 7, acute rheumatic fever. Recurrent pharyngitis, almost certainly streptococcal pharyngitis, reported at age 8. And again, another episode of acute rheumatic fever at age 10. So you may say, well, that's all very interesting, putting that up on the slide. Well, how do we know that that is what he had? And the fact of the matter is, we don't for certain, but I'll tell you what his father said about his erythema nodosa first. He said his little boy had fever with a few painful, very red raised spots the size of an English penny, English pennies like this, over his shins, elbows, and buttocks. Now, maybe you have a different interpretation of that, but to me that sounds strangely like erythema nodosa. How about the acute rheumatic fever, which we don't see much anymore, but I'll get back to? These episodes, again, are described by his father in the following way. His little boy had fever and pain in the feet and knees so intense that he was unable to stand. And these were protracted illnesses at that time. There was also a febrile illness, undiagnosed at age 9, very severe. The general thinking is probably typhus or typhoid fever. We have no way of knowing for sure. Certainly, typhus and typhoid fever were rampant in Europe at the time. Age 11, smallpox. Age 16, he and his sister came down, developed jaundice, probably hepatitis A. He was writing his 7th symphony at that time at age 16. How about that? Age 26, some sort of infectious gastroenteritis. He's writing the Hafner Symphony at that time. And by the time he reaches his 30s, he's pretty much outgrown most of these severe childhood problems, but still complains in letters to and from him of headaches, tonsillitis, stomach cramps, and he had some problems with his teeth. Remember, this was about the time he wrote the dissonant string quartet that we heard. And by the way, I'm sorry, thank you so much. I begged you not to outshine me in anticipation of this talk, and you did. But that's all right. That at least the price of admission has been taken care of. That was absolutely fabulous. Richard, thank you for organizing it. So moving on to the other things we do when we're working up a mysterious case, his physical exam, there's not much to report other than he's got this bulbous nose that and I think this is probably the best portrait of him, that he inherited from his mother. Googly eyes. You get the sense he's got these googly eyes. And you sort of got that from the movie Amadeus as well, which I thought was just terrific. And he wears his hair long, without a wig, supposedly to hide a strange-looking ear that I'll get back to. So his final illness begins when he's 35. Interestingly, this final year for him is unusually healthy. It's as if all his physical disorders have disappeared in anticipation of the coming of the big one. So that final year, he composed La Clemenza di Tito for the coronation of Leopold II, the Magic Flute, a clarinet concerto, a cantata for his Masonic Lodge. He was and began work on his Requiem. Never finished it. Began work on that. He was separated much of the time from his wife Constanza, who was away at a spa being treated for painful varicose veins. That is one of the reasons why speculation arose after he died that could this have been syphilis? Because he was the equivalent of a rock star at that time. He was very famous, separated from his wife, and could there have been some extramarital activities at that time? I'll get back to that. There are many letters from him to Constanza at that time talking about how well he felt. Spent a lot of time talking about what he was doing, the meals he had, one of which was a couple pork cutlets. He says, che gusto. And so Jan Hirschman, who's out in Seattle, came and discussed Herod for us at one of our historical CPCs, decided that those pork cutlets were the key to the case, and published a paper, I think it was in the archives, about 10 years ago, suggesting that Mozart had rip-roaring trichinosis. I'm going to dispense with that by saying that muscle pain is not mentioned in his sister-in-law's account of his illness. And even though she wrote it some 2 decades later, if he had had rip-roaring trichinosis, there is no way they would overlook the pain that he would have been at that time. Trichinosis can cause some minor swelling, but not the kind that Mozart had. So he's 35 years old, he's doing extremely well, and has sudden onset of an illness that is poorly described in his sister-in-law's account of his disorder. Possibly there was fever, possibly there was some headache and sweating, and I'll get back to the fever business at the end, but we don't know that for sure. What we're fairly certain of is that his was part of an epidemic disorder of identical diseases. We know this for 2 reasons. The first being that one of the physicians who consulted on the case, a Dr. von Loebs, when he was dying in Vienna, basically said that his illness was identical to many other residents that he was caring for in Vienna at the time. So kind of park that idea in the back of your mind. I think we have to include that among the known facts of his disorder when we try to come up with a diagnosis. The most striking feature of the illness was progressive swelling. Swelling that came on so quickly and was so massive that his son says in a later document that he was barely recognizable, implying that this is not dependent edema. This is Anasarca, including the face. Son also says that the stench, he was so malodorous that when he finally died, it made his burial very unpleasant for the people who were working with him. So there is one reference in one of the later biographies that he told Constanza several weeks before he died that he had the taste of death in his mouth and that he feared that he was being poisoned by someone with aqua tofana. arsenic. That is just, there's really no evidence for that. He may or may not have had general aches and pains. Again, in one of the later biographies by the Novellas, who interviewed his wife 20-some years after the fact, they write that his limbs were much inflamed and swollen. Well, they were clearly swollen. And the question is, what does inflamed mean? I suspect it is actually a tautology. They're saying the same thing twice. Inflammation, swelling, not necessarily painful, but it's possible that he had painful. He had vomiting and diarrhea only at the very end when he becomes delirious, because he's compos mentis right up to the very end and doing a little work on some of his compositions, but then becomes delirious, vomits a great brown arch, and dies. The official diagnosis that was published, Heiziges Frieselfieber, translated is miliary fever. And basically, that is the only instance where fever is mentioned directly. And so maybe he was febrile and maybe he was not. And here again, the question is, what is the terminology? How does that translate to today's lingua franca? Does it mean a fever with a miliary rash? Well, we don't know, but we need to consider that. So eyewitness accounts, in particular that of his sister-in-law, mention fever only tangentially and never mention a rash. All we have is this official diagnosis. All right, so what are we dealing with? We have an acute, rapidly fatal illness characterized primarily by rapidly developing massive edema. It's part of an epidemic. If what von Loeb said, presumably this epidemic involves adults primarily, because he says the cases are exactly like the ones he's seen. Possibly there was fever, possibly inflamed extremities, possibly, but probably not a rash. So what are we dealing with? This is a case for the UDP outfit. We have anybody here from there? All right. So any case, it seems to me there are only three possibilities to explain this kind of edema. It's got to either be heart, liver, or kidney. So when Faith Fitzgerald, Thea was telling me about Faith, came here and did some CPCs for you. So we had her, we gave her this case, and she diagnosed a acute rheumatic fever as the cause. And there are a number of features of Mozart's illness that would suggest that her diagnosis is correct. He had the recurrent pharyngitis. He had almost certainly had recurrent rheumatic fever as a child. He may or may not have had extremity pain, possibly even joint pain. Heart failure does cause edema. The diagnosis is made, as you all know, still a clinical diagnosis that relies on the Jones criteria. He didn't have chorea. Did he have arthritis? Probably not. And the arthritis of rheumatic fever is really distinctive. It's a migratory arthritis that, as it moves from joint to joint, it leaves one to get another one. The rash is not miliary, but again, we don't know what that terminology meant. It's erythema marginata. If he had subcutaneous nodules, they were not mentioned or detected. But it's possible that he had rheumatic fever, but highly unlikely. First of all, recurrent attacks of rheumatic fever are unlikely to happen in a person of his age. After 20 to 25 years of age, even kids who have had rheumatic fever don't have a recurrence, and if they do, the heart is usually not the primary target of the attacks. But even more importantly, acute rheumatic fever causes a pancarditis if it affects the heart. So that would be the left and the right side of the heart, with emphasis on the left side of the heart. And if the left side was failing, the edema would not be peripheral, it would be in the lungs. And so one of the most prominent symptoms you would expect in somebody who is having acute rheumatic fever with cardiac decompensation would be dyspnea, and this is never mentioned in Mozart's clinical history. In addition to that, although you can see massive edema with heart failure, and this also goes for hepatic failure, it doesn't develop acutely. It is almost always dependent. You just don't see Anasarca. And I'd be interested, if we have a little time at the end, to hear why that is. Why with nephrotic syndrome, you know, with the hypoalbuminemia, et cetera, you get edema everywhere, whereas with the hypoalbuminemia of liver disease, it's predominantly dependent and abdominal. All right, well, so let's say he didn't have acute rheumatic fever. How about he had rheumatic heart disease, valvular disease, and developed endocarditis? Now, there is no more obvious cause of miliary fever, a miliary rash with fever and cardiac decompensation than bacterial endocarditis. Big problem in patients with rheumatic valvular disease, and basically could cause everything we saw in Mozart, including possibly nephrotic syndrome. Big problem is it is not an epidemic disorder. And if there was an epidemic, it's just not tenable to offer that as a diagnosis. So when I first started to wrestle with Mozart, try to figure out what was going on with him, I'm reaching way back and I'm thinking, abnormal ear, a renal problem, and his son has the same ear, by the way. Hereditary problem. What could that be? What could that be? What could that be? Alports. Why couldn't it be Alports? Well, the answer is the ear problem with Alports is not an abnormal external ear, it's deafness. And Mozart had perfect pitch. So this is actually, oh, sorry, my bad. So this is actually Mozart's son's ear. And this is what's published, and supposedly lack of a lobe, a flat helix. You got to view this with a lot of faith. All I can tell you is he had a strange-looking ear that he tried to hide. So what are we left with? We're left with a disorder of the kidney, and without insulting your intelligence, it would have to be a glomerular disorder, and specifically a glomerulonephritis. So what are we talking about? An epidemic glomerulonephritis. We're talking about post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. An acute glomerulonephritis, not horribly epidemic, but could cause an epidemic, a cause of nephrotic syndrome. Jeekers, sounds like it could work. And you can get massive edema with post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. So how about that as a diagnosis? Well, sounds good. However, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis caused by group A beta hemolytic strep pyogenes, is a disease primarily of children. It would be extremely rare to have a case of that in a patient over 30 years of age. Muscle and joint pains are not prominent, but we don't know whether Mozart had that or not. But most important, well, in addition, it's typically an acute disorder, but totally reversible. These kids, for the most part, recover completely in 2 to 4 weeks, and years later, if you test renal function, it's fine. So acute post-strep pyogenes glomerulonephritis would not work. There is, however, another form of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, an epidemic form of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, in fact, which attacks adults, sometimes with fatal consequences. The etiology of this particular form of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis is strep equi, a streptococcus belonging to Lancefield group C. So I'm working on this case, and I'm reading all sorts of things, and I run across this article, I forget which journal, that describes an outbreak of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis caused by strep equi in one of the journals, and it's an outbreak that occurred in Brazil probably 10, 12 years ago. Strep equi, by the way, is the cause of strangles. Anybody have horses? So strangles is one of the most important zoonotic disorders of horses. It's called strangles because it causes inflammation of the, primarily of the nodes in the neck and in the upper airways. It less often affects cattle, but it doesn't affect cattle, and when it does, it gets into the milk. And so that the epidemics of this disorder have been traced to milk and milk products, milk and cheese, etc. So this outbreak in Brazil included 253 cases. 2%, and this is modern and the best possible care, 2% were fatal, and 7% required dialysis. So presumably, that would be at least 10% would have died, and probably substantially more if there were such an epidemic in Vienna in 1791. Over 90% of the cases in this investigation were in adults, and the source was traced to unpasteurized milk. Keep in mind that Pasteur was 50 years in the future at the time Mozart, no, it was more than that. It's probably 80 years in the future at the time Mozart died. So I'm going to offer that as my diagnosis for Mozart. Now, let's just talk briefly about other possibilities. Poison. There's really no poison that could produce this constellation of signs and symptoms that we know about Mozart. Poisons such as mercury, and the Masons were thought to maybe have assassinated him, but he wrote the Magic Flute for Schikaneder, which revealed secrets that were sacred to the Masons. And Schikaneder lived another 20 years. His lodge supported his wife with a grand lodge ceremony. They published the cantata that he had written for him. So it's just unreasonable to think that they were involved in a ritual killing, which has been offered as one of the diagnoses. And of course, Salieri, on his deathbed, vigorously denied having assassinated Mozart. I mean, the only reasonable toxin that was available was mercury. He could have treated himself for syphilis with mercury and poisoned himself, but that's primarily a tubular rather than a glomerular toxin, and wouldn't expect to cause a nephrotic syndrome. In addition to that, it wouldn't be a cause of an epidemic that raged in Vienna at the time. Syphilis, something to think about. could cause exactly what we've seen here. A rare cause of malignant syphilis is malignant nephrotic syndrome. Syphilis is an epidemic disorder, but malignant nephrotic syndrome caused by syphilis is not. Probably then, although in Europe at that time, it's estimated that at least 10% of the population was infected. You could have a lot of syphilis and damn little epidemic nephrotic syndrome. And perhaps most importantly, there is no credible evidence that Mozart was ever unfaithful to Constanza or vice versa. So what about this epidemic nature of the disease? Let me read you the quote that von Lobes gave. This is exactly what he says. After Mozart had died and he's talking about his illness, he said, "A great number of the inhabitants of Vienna were at the time laboring under the same complaint, and the number of cases which terminated fatally, like that of Mozart's, was considerable. I saw the body, Mozart's body, after death, and it exhibited no appearances beyond those usual in such cases." So that sounds pretty convincing. So I've given this talk at a number of places, and several times people have come up to me and they've said, why don't you go to Vienna and check the records and see if there really was an epidemic? And I think, well, how the hell am I going to do that? And so in the annals, probably 5 years ago, there was such an investigation. One of the authors was from Vienna, one was from Switzerland, and I think one was the UK. And they got a hold of the, what do they call it? The daily death records from Vienna. The winter of 91, the winter of 90, and the winter of 92. And they looked at the causes of death that were listed. So 91 is the winter that Mozart died. And they found that the most common cause of death was TB. The second most common cause of death was malnutrition, inanition. And the third most common cause was actually edema. And what they showed was there was a definite spike during the winter of 91, a substantial spike, and they got the graphs in there. And so additional evidence that in fact there was an epidemic disorder going on at the time. So we have the capacity to reach back in time with these molecular techniques and test things and potentially verify or negate some of these philosophies. And wouldn't it be nice to have a piece of Mozart that we could examine using modern molecular techniques? Well, unfortunately, Mozart, and I'm sure those of you who've seen Amadeus, realize that he was buried in a common grave, doused with quicklime to accelerate decomposition, and then covered up and lost. Well, there is a theory that the sexton at St. Mark's Cemetery outside of Vienna, where he was buried, marked the skull of Mozart, and 10 years later went back, dug it up, and through a circuitous route found its way to the Mozarteum in Salzburg. So if we could just get a piece of that skull, maybe we could test it for syphilis or strep equi. The problem is that that skull has a linear fracture of the temporal bone with a calcified subdural hematoma. And there is no record of Mozart ever having any kind of head trauma. So I suspect that the Mozarteum in Salzburg has the skull of some other dearly departed soul as its principal relic. So I'm going to quote Faith Fitzgerald here as she concluded her discussion of Mozart by saying, Ultimately, although a finite number of diseases might reasonably account for the essential elements of Mozart's illness, as gleaned from this limited clinical record, it's not likely we will ever know for certain the specific culprit that carried him off. And that skull in the Mozarteum, unfortunately, is not going to help us. And here's what Faith had to say, which was a great ending. She said, "We just might have to accept the fact that we can find no better explanation than the one offered, no better explanation than that the heavenly choir simply wanted a choir master worthy of their celestial talent." Thank you very much.